Here's your news for April 15th, 2020. We're starting today with news from the world of politics, as President Donald Trump recently name-dropped Vince McMahon as a man who will help him reopen the U.S. Referring to the boss as the great Vince McMahon during a Rose Garden press conference, Trump also called on leaders from other sports, including Dana White, Jerry Jones, Roger Goodell, Mark Cuban, and others, who will assist the president in a panel of advisors. In a speech, the president said that he expects 29 states to be, quote, back to normal by the end of the month, and also said that the U.S. is tired of watching 14-year-old baseball games. The friendship between Trump and McMahon goes way back, as Vince was recently on a call with the president and other sporting leaders, and Trump was also inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2013. This week also saw Linda McMahon, who previously worked as Trump's small business administrator, promise $18.5 million to the state of Florida as part of a presidential super PAC the same day that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced WWE as an essential service, as the WWE will be open for business even with Vince working alongside Trump. Now, over the past month or so, you may have heard about the All-In challenge that is taking the world by storm. And now, The Undertaker has decided to take part. If you didn't know, the challenge sees celebrities offer once-in-a-lifetime experiences that fans can win at auction, with the money being raised donated to a handful of charities to help those affected by the ongoing situation. Taking to Instagram, the dead man offered his 2.5 million followers a chance to bid on a dinner and one-of-a-kind gift from the man himself, with the bidding starting at $2,500 and lasting 10 days. According to the official website, all the money raised through this auction will go directly to Feeding America, Meals on Wheels, World Central Kitchen, and No Kid Hungry. As part of the challenge, the dead man called out Post Malone and welder Jesse James to join in, and it's great to see those with the fan base and influence doing their part to help those struggling at the moment. We're heading to Monday Night Raw now, as this week's show saw Jerry Lawler return after missing WrestleMania 36, and the King quickly stirred up some controversy. During a match featuring Akira Tozawa, King referred to the former Cruiserweight Champion's moonsault as a ramen noodle moonsault, playing on the popular dish in Asian culture. Many fans weren't happy with stereotyping Tozawa in this way, and this isn't even the first time Lawler has done this sort of thing, as he referred to Humberto Carrillo as a Mexican jumping bean not too long ago. Even last week, Lawler said that the Street Profits have Kool-Aid in the red Solo cups, playing on the stereotypes of black people loving Kool-Aid. Unsurprisingly, the WWE opted to edit the line out of their Hulu version of the show, and given that Lawler had to travel quite a distance just to make it to the Performance Center, fans will have to wait and see whether WWE has him back, considering all the risks involved. The ironic thing here is that lines such as these could be edited out of the show if it was pre-taped like other wrestling promotions, but last week saw Vince McMahon announce that the show would be live again, despite some complaints from superstars. Though some defended the King, others asked how people can defend Lawler on comments like these, and while Lawler is yet to comment publicly on the situation, this certainly isn't a good look for the Hall of Famer. One man who knows all about commentary controversy is Jim Cornette, who was in a similar situation to the King not too long ago. In case you forgot, Cornette was axed from NWA Power for commenting that Trevor Murdoch is, quote, the only man I know that can strap a bucket of fried chicken on his back and ride a motor scooter across Ethiopia, which many fans saw as playing on the racial stereotype of black people loving fried chicken. On Twitter, Cornette was his usual self, saying that modern-day wrestling fans don't deserve good wrestling, and questioned how these people go out in public without breaking out in tears. Time will tell whether WWE takes any action against the King for his statement, as at this time, not traveling to the Performance Center may be the best thing for the 70-year-old, even though he wants to commentate. We're looking once again at WWE being determined an essential service recently by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, which interestingly came shortly after Linda McMahon promised Orlando and Tampa a hefty $18.5 million through a presidential super PAC. Speaking at a press conference, DeSantis compared WWE's situation to Disney World, who is allowed to have people on their grounds. He said, Disney asked for some of the gardening people to go, because they have millions of dollars worth of stuff there, and it's just gonna go bad. I said, is there gonna be social distancing? They said, yeah, they're just gonna go out there and work themselves. Obviously, WWE, there's no crowd, and it's just a very, very small group of people. We just look at it on a case-by-case basis. We haven't had a lot of requests. I think a lot of this will be, what do we look like in May with some of this, rather than, can we do stuff? The one thing I support is, I think we do need to support content, especially sports and events. Not saying they'll have a crowd there, but if NASCAR can have a race and televise it without having a large crowd, I think that's a good thing. He continued to say, I think people are starved for content. We haven't had a lot of content since the beginning of March. If people are being told to stay by the house, this is something for them to do. Saying that this current situation has never been experienced in the sporting realm, DeSantis spoke about WWE being allowed to film, saying that new WWE content is the light at the end of the tunnel, and on a psychological perspective, I think that's a good thing. While the media is making quite a big deal about WWE being allowed to film in Florida, this announcement also means that AEW will be able to film in the state, though nobody seems to be bringing them up. Although DeSantis has said that people want to see new content, the numbers don't reflect that, as recent viewing figures for WWE are down, though the company will still carry on throughout the ongoing situation with the state of Florida behind them as well. What's interesting is that even after being deemed an essential service, the WWE recently had their live recording interrupted by police, as John Alba reports that the Orange County Sheriff was called to investigate the Performance Center on Monday. After a regular checkup on the venue, the sheriff left, though this isn't the first time that this sort of thing has happened. On Wrestling Observer Live, Brian Alvarez noted that WWE had quite the large crew at this week's tapings, which even included some staff that may not have been essential. He said, "The barber was there, and I'm not making that up. It's like a full WWE production again. It's like they've gone full speed ahead." With these political twists and turns, what's going on behind the scenes in WWE looks more like an episode of The West Wing, and the timeline of what exactly happened when can be a bit confusing. Now, Stephanie Quigno and John Alba of Spectrum News and Sports have pieced together a very interesting timeline, and it does look like money was promised before some big favors were granted for the McMahons. This timeline starts on April 1st, when DeSantis issued an executive order for essential services after speaking to the president. On April 9th, DeSantis altered the order to include sporting events and media productions such as WWE, and that same day, Linda McMahon announced her $18.5 million super PAC spend to Tampa and Orlando. The next day, reports broke of Vince McMahon deciding to go live with WWE. And while we can't say for definite that Linda's $18.5 million promise to Florida helped influence DeSantis' decision, this is a very interesting possibility. We're leaving the political world to focus on Vickie Guerrero, who, after years in wrestling, has a lot of cool things around her home. Recently, Vickie tweeted out a picture of a handwritten booking sheet from 2002 that she found while cleaning out some boxes. And this show included huge matches, such as The Undertaker defending his WWE Championship against Ric Flair, and her husband Eddie Guerrero taking on Chris Benoit. From the document, it looks like these matches were planned for house shows between July 12th and July 15th, 2002, and Jim Ross confirmed the booking sheet is genuine, and in his own handwriting. While Vickie hasn't been on WWE since the 1000th episode of SmackDown, the former general manager has worked with AEW as a guest commentator on Dark, as it's clear that she still has a love for professional wrestling. From one former WWE general manager to another now, as Paul Heyman has settled in nicely to his role as Raw's executive director. Recently, WWE saw Austin Theory called up to the Red Brand, including a match at WrestleMania. And although Vince McMahon is still the deciding force in WWE, Dave Meltzer explained on Wrestling Observer Radio that Theory's call-up was thanks to Heyman. He said, "This isn't Vince. This is definitely Heyman, and Austin Theory was brought up because they needed a guy for WrestleMania and they were impressed enough. It's too early, way too early, but those are the breaks. They like the idea of the three-person stable with Zelina Vega, Andrade, Angel Garza, and Austin Theory. Time will tell just how successful the 22-year-old superstar will be on the Red Brand, as he is the latest addition to Zelina Vega's stable." And finally, we bring you Raw ratings from this week. WWE Raw brought another episode from an empty Performance Center this week. It was a live show because that's what Vince McMahon decided they're going to do. How did the viewership perform this week? Showbuzz Daily reports that WWE Raw drew a 3-hour average of 1.913 million viewers. This is not a good sign and marks the second week recently where the 3-hour average was below 2 million. Last week, the Red Brand's show brought in 2.118 million viewers on the Raw after WrestleMania 36. Vince McMahon's mandate that WWE provide live programming obviously didn't spark a ratings surge.